Clemson's season, again, Caleb, I'll start with you on this one. Um, Not the season they wanted, but was it a bad season?
I'm gonna go similar to B plus, and I say that because that Georgia loss to start the season, I think, just looks really bad when you examine the whole season. I know Georgia at that point is extremely talented, but you have that, and you factor in the loss to Louisville, which I don't know if you just looking at the schedule like that's a loss that kind of makes your head scratch. They almost lost to Pittsburgh if Clay Clement didn't scramble for 60 yards. So, they escaped a couple of games, but they won the games in the conference when it mattered. They did lose to South Carolina, who it was a pretty solid team this year. But I think when Dabo Sweeney and Clemson kind of looked back on the season, they felt like that it wasn't like teams that they had before. So I kind of go with the B plus. It wasn't a horrible season, but it wasn't probably what Clemson wanted.
Yeah, I think when you look at when you look at their season, like you said, I think if you take the Clemson and Georgia and move that game from week 1 to week 12, it's completely different because Clemson was a offensively their identity was insanely different than what they were week 1. They didn't know who they were. They didn't know what TJ Moore was going to be. They didn't know what Bryant Wesco was going to be. Um, Cade from week 1 to week 12 was completely different. So um, I that right there again goes back to kind of what you were saying, where um, it's not a bad season, but it's not the season they wanted either. They were still very young. The loss to Louisville was head scratching. The way they lose to South Carolina, I mean, they drive all the way down the field. There's like what 2 minutes left. Tip pass, diving interception. Like that's just unlucky. You know what I mean? So I don't think it was a bad season given how young they were. The Georgia loss is a bad stain that looks worse than it actually was in the grand scheme of things. Now, if you lose 44-10 against Georgia in week 7, week 12, whatever, it's a different story. Losing to them week 1 in Atlanta is what it is. Um, Louisville loss is questionable. South Carolina, again, it kind of looks worse than it actually was. Like you played them really, really close. That was a 9-3 South Carolina team that was pretty good. Um, so ultimately, my grade for Clemson is going to be that it's going to be B plus as well. It's just it looks worse than it was, but you still found a way to win the ACC. You still found a way to make the college football playoffs, and I think Clemson fans might be the most level-headed, realistic about expectations when it comes to it. Like if you win your conference, if you make the college football playoffs, that's really all you can ask for out of a coach these days when things are so the parity in college football is a lot more than what it used to be in the past.
See, we're knocking the Louisville loss, but Louisville, 3 of the 4 losses were to ranked teams. Notre Dame, SMU, we know they got to, and Miami, right? And then the fourth loss was to a bad Stanford team. So outside of the Stanford loss, Louisville had 3 good losses. So we're using that, but to use that to measure like a Clemson season, I give Clemson more of an A minus than anything. Yeah, you lost a bad opening game to Georgia, but you beat the teams in front of you that you were supposed to beat. Yeah, you're confident. Much like we said earlier when we were picking the ACC, you don't have to play certain teams. They didn't have to play Miami. They didn't play Georgia Tech. They didn't play SMU until the conference championship game. So the hardest game they had were Louisville and Pittsburgh, who, outside of a big run by Kate Klubnik, you're about to lose that game. You win the games you're supposed to in dominating fashion, except for one of them. And the Louisville loss, and depending on how you judge their losses, it wasn't that bad in the grand scheme because they had 3 ranked losses. Losing to South Carolina, and that's a team that a lot of people thought should have been in the playoffs. You don't want to lose that game at home in a rivalry game, but it's a rivalry game. Same way we knock Ohio State for losing to Michigan. It's a rivalry game, in-state rivalry game. In diving and what the pick and the diving pick at the end of the game, you can't really knock certain things like that for certain bad bounces. I'd give them an A minus because they still won their conference. they didn't have to play the harder teams, but when they finally got a team that was hard in their conference, they beat them, and they were winning the game handily in the first half before SMU made a run. Losing to Texas the way they lost to Texas is just an overpowering team, and there's a big difference between Texas football and then Clemson and the ACC football. But I'd give Clemson an A minus.
And going back to Pitt for just a second, if Eli Holston doesn't get hurt, that's a different Pitt team too. I mean, he had them like 6-0, something like that, to start the season before he got hurt with that concussion and put him out, I think, 2 weeks. I'm pretty sure he missed that game, or maybe it was the first game he came back, something like that. So that is another thing too. You have to look at Clemson's season and consider like the teams they played. So did they beat the teams they were supposed to beat? In reality, they probably should have went 10-0 in ACC and non-con play outside of Georgia and South Carolina. One loss to Georgia wouldn't hurt anything against them. You lost to Georgia, oh well, but that loss to South Carolina is, it taints the resume just a little bit. Not much, but it still hurts. Regardless, so I think again we all kind of agree it wasn't a bad season for Clemson. Could have been better, but it's still kind of above expectations, if you will. Like the expectations were when the ACC made the college football playoffs, you accomplished that. Can't really ask for much more.
But even if we use Pitt, just to kind of piggyback on the Eli Holston got hurt, but he was kind of shooken up the week before when they lost to Virginia. They got blown out. Pitt got blown out on the road to a good SMU team at that point, who had just found their stride, and then they kind of tailspin because of Holston getting hurt, and he never really recovered after that. They lost, I believe, the last 6 games of the season, but Pitt started off 7-0. So Pitt, the rest of the team still performed really well until that point. Then once the quarterback got shaken up, we know how that goes. When your captain's gone, your leader's gone, everything else kind of goes down the drain there. But Pitt was still a good team and had only lost 2 games before then, and one of them they lost with the quarterback being halfway out. So Pitt was a better loss than a lot of people give it credit for, a better win than a lot of people get credit for.